In this video, let's talk about v-bind directive. Let's go to VS Code. Let me create a Git branch for this view concept, so it will be easier for you to review the code later. Git branch v-bind git switch v-bind. So please note the lower left corner of the VS Code. We're now on this newly created v-bind branch. I've already copied the starter code. So in app.view, let me delete all of those and paste. So here in the template, we have a h1, and it is referring to a JavaScript variable that we defined here. We also have an image with src and also a button. It's very simple. In the style block, we defined several CSS rules: image, active class, inactive class, center class. We'll use them later. Also, I prepared some images, and I'm going to copy them into the public. So as you can see, under this image folder, there are 3 JPEG files: banner 1, banner 2, banner 3, and here this image is referring to banner 1. Okay. In the last video, you saw that Vue makes it easy for the HTML code to access data defined in the script using the mustache notation, like here. We call this data binding. We're binding data we defined in the script, the JavaScript variable, into the HTML code in the template. In this video, let's continue this topic, data binding in Vue.js. Now think about this. An HTML element has multiple attributes. For example, if you look at line 3, this image element has an src attribute. What about a tag or the anchor tag? It has an href attribute. The input element has a value attribute. And every HTML element has ID, class, style, attribute. There is a need to dynamically change the attribute value of an HTML element. For example, right now, this image element shows banner1.jpg. So what I want to do next is when I click this change image button, I want this image element to show banner2.jpg. How do I do that? Well, in vanilla.js, we need to first use getElementById to grab this image element and then use the setAttribute function to update the src attribute. You see, it is not very convenient since you need to perform DOM operations. And you're like, hey, can we use the mustache notation we just learned in the last video inside this attribute? Unfortunately, mustaches do not work inside HTML attributes. Instead, we should use the v-bind directive for binding data from the script to the attributes of HTML elements. Here we go. So first, let me copy this value here. And in the script, let me define a variable. Let's call this image URL. So what I want to do is to bind this variable into this attribute. Apparently here, I cannot hard code it anymore. And we're going to put this image URL. Well, this is not enough. If you do this, this image element will treat this variable name, image URL, as the path to an image. In other words, it is not a variable, but a string literal. And apparently this is wrong because there's no such path called image URL. To let Vue interpret this as a variable or expression instead of a string literal, we need to use the v-bind directive in front of this src attribute. So here is the syntax: v-bind : Okay, notice the color of this image URL also changes. So now it is interpreted as a variable, just like message. It is not a string, but a string is in this color, right? So let's go ahead and start our project to test. Okay, then let me put my VS Code and browser side by side. As you can see, it is working, right? we're binding the data image URL from the script into the HTML code in the template. But this time, we're binding it to the attribute src. Because v-bind is so commonly used, it has a dedicated shorthand syntax. So let me copy this and show the shorthand. You can simply just leave out the v-bind and only have this colon. So line 3 and line 5, they are equivalent. So for the rest of the tutorial, I will be using shorthand syntax in code examples, as that's the most common usage for Vue developers. Next, let's work on this click event. In Vue.js, it is easy to define and handle a click event. Here is the syntax. @click. And here we're going to be invoking a method, change image. So down here, let's define this change image in the script. The good thing about Vue.js is you do not need to use getElementById. Instead, you only change the value in image URL. So here we can write image URL is equal to a new value. For example, we copy this and put it here, change this to 2. So when I click this button right here, I want both images to show me a new picture, banner2.jpg. All right. By the way, don't worry about the syntax for now. We'll talk about event handling in Vue.js later. All right. So now let me click change image. It doesn't work. Well, it turns out that we need to explicitly ask Vue to track this image URL variable. For now, it is not tracking it. There is a fancy name for this mechanism. It is called reactivity. And here is the syntax. We need to wrap this value in a ref method. But first, we need to import it. Import ref from Vue. Okay, and here we need to add dot value. Okay, for now, don't worry about ref and this dot value. You just need to know that we need to wrap the data in this ref method, and when we access this data in the script, we need to add a dot value. We will explain them in detail in the next video. Okay, now, let me refresh. If I click change image, great, it changes. I hope you can appreciate this. Compare with the vanilla JS, where you have to use getElementById and use .setAttribute. Here, we're not touching the DOM. We're not using getElementById or query selector. All we did is we changed the value in image URL. Vue will react and automatically update the HTML. So we only need to focus and work with the data. No need to worry about DOM operations. For your information, if the bound value is null or undefined, for example here, if I'm going to put null or I do not define image URL, then this attribute will simply be removed from the rendered element. Let me show you more examples. Here, I'm going to define an input box. And we know that the input box has an attribute called value. For example, here I can put write something here and save. And now it has this value in the input box. But in this case, we kind of hard-coded the value here. Now instead, let me cut this and change this one to a variable. Let's call this default input text. And then down here, let's define this in the script. Let default input text is equal to this one. All right. But this one doesn't work. Without v-bind, this default input text is not interpreted as a variable. So we need to add v-bind, colon. Save. Okay. Now the content we defined in variable default input text is shown here. Okay, so here is the documentation of Vue.js. Since Vue 3.4, if the attribute has the same name with the JavaScript value being bound, the syntax can be further shortened to omit the attribute value, like this. Also, we can dynamically bind multiple attributes. If you have a JavaScript object representing multiple attributes that looks like this, in this object of attributes, we have ID and class. Instead of writing two v-binds in this div, we can simply just use this syntax, v-bind object of attributes. Okay, let's go back to VS Code and let me show you more about v-bind. Do you remember the important class and style attribute of every HTML element? Yes, the sweet memories from your CSS class. We use them to style HTML elements. One important use case of v-bind is that we can use it to programmatically change the CSS of an HTML element. Recall that we defined several CSS classes here: active, inactive, and center. So next, let me show you how do we use v-bind with CSS classes. The easiest way to use v-bind for CSS is to bind the name of the CSS class to an element. So for example, here, let's say we have a P and it says Harry Potter. Let me split my VS Code editor. So here is class. Let's say a class name. All right. So let's go to script. And let's define this class name to be, for example, active. Save. Okay. So here, as you can see, Harry's name is green. If you look at line 26, here we define a class name is equal to one class name we defined here, active. And then on line 11, we use v-bind to bind this class name to the class attribute. That's why Harry's name is green. The second way to use v-bind with CSS is that we can put a JavaScript object in this class attribute. And we can have multiple CSS classes toggled by having more fields in this object. So here, first, let me define two Boolean variables. Let is inactive, assignment operator, ref, true, and the let is center, ref, false. We're using is inactive to toggle the CSS class inactive. We're using is center to toggle the class center. Okay, then let's go back to the template. And let me do this again, P. And here is still Harry Potter. But this time, we're going to bind an object to it. Class. The first CSS class here is inactive. Is inactive. And the second CSS class is center. Is center. All right, so here let me show the script. Now, as you can see, there are actually two CSS classes applied to this p tag. Inactive and center. And in this case, since is inactive is true, and this one is on. That's why the color here is red, and there is a strike through. Is center is false. That's why this one is not centered. But what if I change this one to true as well? Now, as you can see, both CSS classes are on. Let me change this one. This should be a Boolean variable. Okay. Next, let me change this one to false. So in this case, both CSS classes are off. So even though they're here, but they're controlled by the two Boolean data. So in summary, the syntax at line 13 means that the presence of inactive class and the center class really depends on the truth value of is inactive and is center that we defined in the script down here. So as a programmer, I can easily control the CSS using the data and no more DOM operations. We can also bind an array of CSS classes to the class attribute using v-bind. So here is P, still Harry Potter. And this time, I'm going to put an array here. For example, here, this time I'm going to use active. So the third Harry Potter is green now. And I can keep doing this, having a center. Now it's centered. So in summary, I showed you 3 ways of using v-bind with CSS. Number 1, you can put the CSS class in a variable, like here, class name, and put it into this :class attribute. The second way is that you can pass a JS object that has these properties. The property names are the names of the CSS classes, and their values are either true or false. Those are the Boolean variables that we define in the script. So if I have like 5 CSS classes, then I need to define 5 true or false values so we can control them here. The third way is that we can simply put an array in this v-bind. Next, let's apply what we just learned to the Hogwarts shopping cart project. Okay, it's Hogwarts shopping cart time. Let's apply what we just learned, v-bind, into our Hogwarts shopping cart project. Right now, as you can see, the src and alt of the image are hard-coded. But both are available in the data. Look at here. So this is the data of the first cart item. So what we should do is, let's delete this part. And then let's make this a v-bind. So here will be shopping cart items. The first one, dot, image. Save. As you can see, it works, right? Now, same thing here. So simply the name of this item. Okay, so it works. So go ahead and change the src and alt attribute for other cart items. There's one more thing we need to change here, which is the quantity. Now, as you can see, we hard-coded 3 to the value attribute of input. So for example, if I change this to 4 and refresh, this one becomes 4. But this value really should come from here, from the data. So let's turn this into v-bind as well. Shopping cart 0 dot quantity. Good. So right now it's 3. If I change this to 30, now it's 30, right? So let me change it back. So next, go ahead and change the value attribute of the input for other cart items. All right, next, let's move on to order summary. So here, there is a toggle button. So if I click this hide details, subtotal, shipping estimate, and text estimate will be hidden. If I click again, it will show all the details. Then how do we implement that? If you take a look at our current CSS, there is a CSS class called hide order details. What it does is to set the display to none. So for example, if I copy this class name and paste it to here, this div actually includes all the summary items. So if I put it here, as you can see, the details are hidden. If I remove it, the details are shown. So what I want to do is use a click event to control the on and off of this class. So here is on, here is off. So what should I do? v-bind. So let's go ahead and go to the script. And down here, let's define a variable to control the on and off of that class. So let's call this let hide details. And by default, it is false. Okay, so when the pages load, by default, we're not hiding the details. We want to show the details. Okay, then let's go to this button, the toggle button here, and define a click event, @click. So it's very simple. So when we click this button, we're going to flip the truth value of hide details. Hide details is equal to exclamation mark hide details. Let's go to class here. First, let's make this class a v-bind. And remember the syntax? We're going to use a JavaScript object. The property name is the name of the CSS class, which is hide order details. And its value is the Boolean data here. So note that if the CSS class name contains dashes, you have to use single quotes to enclose it. If it does not have dashes, then you do not need quotes. So this is the class name, and this is a variable that controls this is on or off. So right now it is off. So what if I change this one to true? Save. Now it's off. So let's go back here. Let me refresh. Okay. So now it is off. All right. Okay. Next, let's test this hide details button. So here, if I click hide details, it is hiding. If I click again, the details showed up. Very great. Well, there is a small problem because for now, it makes sense for the button to say hide details. But once I click this one, it should change the content of this toggle button to say show details, right? So what should we do? So how do I change the content in the button based on this hide details value, true or false? We can use mustache notation. Right now, this name is hard-coded, hide details, right? So let me cut this and use a mustache notation. And inside, I'm going to use a ternary operation. So the content on the toggle button really depends on the truth value of hide details. So here I'm going to say hide details. If it is true, then we're going to render show details. Otherwise, hide details. All right, so let me refresh. So by default, it is hide details. If I click hide details, now the details are hidden. Also, the text on the toggle button is show details. For line 154, later on, when we learn computed properties, you can choose to use computed properties to refactor this code. All right, next, let's go back to Learn View 3 with Bingyang project and do a quick summary of v-bind. In summary, v-bind is a directive used to bind a JavaScript expression to an HTML attribute. It allows you to dynamically set one or more attributes of an HTML element to the value of a JavaScript expression. And one important use case of v-bind is manipulating an HTML element's class list and inline styles. I put some comments in my code demo and well formatted. Next, let me commit and push my code to GitHub. Git add, git commit. Let's call this attribute bindings. Git push. Okay. In this video, you saw something like ref and dot value. We'll explain them in the next video. That is Vue's reactivity system. See you there.